Good evening. Welcome to this year's presentation of Debating Public Policy, co-hosted by the Program for Public Discourse and the Steamboat Institute. I'm Kevin Marinelli, Executive Director of the Program for Public Discourse. I want to begin by putting a few items on students' radar. First, next week on Wednesday, November 6th, the day after the election, the Agora Fellows are going to host a public forum for students to come and share their concerns and reflect on their experiences with the election that just unfolded. So we invite you to come and participate in that. That will be next Wednesday afternoon at 4 o'clock here in the Union. Second, we want to invite students to participate in our upcoming annual speech competition. This year's theme is Empowering North Carolina, and students across the university are welcome to participate in that competition on December 3rd. And finally, we want to let you know that the Program for Public Discourse will soon be accepting applications for next year's Agora Fellowship. So if you're interested in any of those opportunities, we invite you to go on our website or simply follow up with me directly. You can talk to me after tonight's event about any of those opportunities. Our mission at the PPD is to foster civic virtue by promoting civil debate. And typically, we have done that by identifying the most urgent, contested issues and tackling them head on. Tonight, however, we're going to depart from our usual tact. Rather than engage a widely contested issue, instead, we're going to investigate one of our nation's deepest core values: democracy itself. You know, when I go around making the case for the Program for Public Discourse, I often rely on some knee-jerk, admittedly lazy cliches. Argumentative reasoning is essential to promote democratic values, I'll often attest. Recently, however, an Agora Fellow pushed back and asked, what do we mean when we say democratic values? Indeed, such a question is asked too infrequently. What exactly are democratic values? And should we prioritize those values above others? Now, believe me, I am well aware of the navel-gazing risk of such an academic exercise, especially amidst a presidential election of palpably high stakes. I would wager, however, that it is our responsibility, if we truly want to fearlessly tackle the toughest issues, it is our responsibility to step back every once in a while and interrogate our own values, the very values that constitute the Program for Public Discourse and constitute our nation as a public. And that is exactly what we intend to do this evening with two eminent political philosophers. And to introduce them is also the moderator of tonight's event and our co-host, Executive Vice President and Tony Blankley Senior Fellow at Steamboat Institute, Hadley Heath Manning.
Good evening, and thank you, Kevin, for a warm welcome. For me, coming back to campus at Carolina is a homecoming. I am a Tar Heel. I'm originally from Shelby, North Carolina, and I was a student here from 2006 to 2010. So for those of you who keep track of it this way, I was here when Tyler Hansborough was here. While I was a student here, I heard a chant, not infrequently, and I want to know if it's still a chant used on campus. And it went something like this. This is what democracy looks like. Do people still do that? Oh man, I don't know if that's for the better or for the worse, but it was a chant, not infrequently used, usually in protest. But we're going to talk about what democracy looks like tonight. And I'm so happy to see such a good turnout for this event. I want to also say hello to our audience that may be watching on the live stream on the Steamboat Institute's YouTube channel. And of course, I want to thank our co-sponsors for our event tonight, the Carolina Program for Public Discourse, the Carolina Liberty Foundation, and the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. I want to share just a brief background of the Campus Liberty Tour debate series. This is our second Campus Liberty Tour debate on campus at UNC Chapel Hill. We were here last fall with a debate on net zero climate goals. We host these debates around the country, and tonight's debate is the 6th stop this semester. We have been to 7 campuses. We will go to 7 campuses in 7 states over a 7-week period. And so far this semester, we've been to Brown, Virginia Military Institute, Harvard, University of Texas, and University of Maryland. So this is stop number 6. We will also go to New College of Florida. You can view the full debate schedule, including topics and speakers, at steamboatinstitute.org. You can watch any of our previous debates on our YouTube channel. And our focus with all of these debates is always on civility and on critical thinking. Our hope is to show students and all who attend how to think, not what to think. And in that spirit, we had at the entry tonight a worksheet that you can follow along if you would like to use this. This is just a piece of paper where you can write down some of the points from either debater that you found compelling. Sometimes people come to a debate with a pretty strong opinion beforehand, how they're going to feel. And you may not change your opinion, but if you can come to better understand either or both sides, then I call it a success. As a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, Steamboat Institute relies on the support of many generous individuals and foundations to bring programs such as tonight's debate to audiences across the country. So I'd like to extend a special thank you to the Adolph Kors Foundation, the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation, the Lynn and Harry Bradley Foundation, the Jack Roth Charitable Foundation, the Tina Snyder Foundation, and the Arthur N. Root Foundation for their support, which is allowing us to expand this program to more campuses. So let's get to it. Does the U.S. need more democracy? I'm not going to say much more about that at this juncture because first I'm going to invite all of our audience members to respond with your own views on this question. We have a pre-debate poll, so you can respond agree, disagree, or undecided. Does the U.S. need more democracy? Use the QR code that's been provided. We're also going to take your pulse again and ask your opinion again after the debate is over to see if there's been any movement in these numbers. We strongly encourage everyone to take a moment, vote with your phones to make the polling as representative as possible of the views of our audience. Vote democratically, you might say. And those of you watching the live stream should see a link in the chat to vote. You can click on that link to participate in our poll. All right, now it's my pleasure to introduce our debaters. Dr. Hélène Landemore is a professor of political science at Yale University with a specialization in political theory. Her research and teaching interests include, among other things, democratic theory, political epistemology, and the ethics and politics of artificial intelligence. She's also a fellow at the Ethics and AI Institute at the University of Oxford and an advisor to the Democratic Inputs to AI program at OpenAI. She served on the governance committee of the most recent French Citizens Convention and is currently undertaking work supported by the Schmidt Futures through the AI 2050 program. Hélène will be arguing the affirmative tonight, that yes, the U.S. needs more democracy. And Dr. Jason Brennan is the Robert J. and Elizabeth Flanagan Family Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. He specializes in politics, philosophy, and economics. He's the editor-in-chief of Philosophy and Public Affairs, editor of Public Affairs Quarterly, and an associate editor of Social Philosophy and Policy. He recently completed a $2.1 million project on markets, social entrepreneurship, and effective altruism funded by the Templeton Foundation. He chairs the Designing the Futures Committee at Georgetown and serves on the Georgetown Faculty Senate. He's the author of 17 books, including one titled Against Democracy. So you might deduce from that information that he will be arguing, no, the U.S. does not need more democracy. So thank you to our panelists. We're going to begin with 5-minute opening remarks, first from Dr. Landemore.
Thank you, Hadley, for this generous introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So I will be arguing for more democracy. But mostly what I want to argue is that we need a different kind of democracy. because more of what we currently call democracy is only going to end in disaster if it's not too late already. So what we call democracy in this country is hyper-partisan electoral competition, which in the institutional context of a very imperfect, counter-majoritarian, pre-democratic constitution, and also in the current context of crony capitalism, has increasingly led to a regime better characterized as the tyranny of powerful minorities. Those minorities include very wealthy minorities as well as very racist and xenophobic ones. So this is not a good place to be in. And critics like my colleagues Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt have written recently a very compelling case for seeing the United States today as in fact a form of minority rule. The usual recommendations from that camp consist in advocating for returning us to a past stage when the country was more majoritarian, or a situation where we could sort of curb the counter-majoritarian tendencies of that regime. So their solutions involve abolishing the Electoral College, which stands in the way of direct expression of the popular will and majorities, reapportioning or entirely abolishing the Senate, which is a sort of counter-majoritarian institution as well, where you need 60 votes to get anything done. Non-majoritarian threshold, super-majoritarian threshold, using proportional representation rather than first past the post, curbing gerrymandering, ending life tenure for Supreme Justices, and generally moving us toward a more majoritarian form of democracy, closer to what other advanced democracies in the West have been doing over the last centuries. That's all good, but it's more of the same kind of democracy in a way. It's majority rule within a sort of constitutional framework that protects minority rights, which is in a way the bare minimum for democracy. This vision to me is still too purely aggregative, adversarial, agonistic, based on the conflict of party positions, and individualistic, focused on the citizen qua voter, isolated at the voting booth. And in fact, the problems we observe in the US are also observed in other democracies. So making the US less of an outlier will not solve all these problems since they exist elsewhere. So luckily, since the 1990s, philosophers like Jürgen Habermas and others have come up with an alternative model of democracy called deliberative democracy. In this ideal of democracy, people don't simply vote and hope to see their party win. They instead talk to each other, they deliberate, they exchange arguments, they try to convince and persuade each other, and they hopefully reach a consensus whereby positions can be accommodated, including those of the minorities. In this vision, the representatives too seek to deliberate and exchange arguments together in a parliament, which is a place where you're supposed to talk to each other. And they're supposed to work collaboratively to find solutions that work for all. And this sounds to me quite wonderful. I'm sure to you it sounds like science fiction. Because indeed, there's currently no space for that kind of deliberative politics in our current democracies. Electoral politics and political campaigns encourage us to demonize each other. Congress is a place where people fight and maneuver, posture and torture the truth, but rarely exchange arguments in good faith in the hope of figuring out something that works for all. It's true on gun regulation, it's true on a range of issues. So we need to create those deliberative spaces. And to do so, we can start by looking to an institution that we are all familiar with, which is American as spy, truly democratic, the jury. The jury is a group of randomly selected citizens. Sorry, this is gonna ring in a minute. Brought together to talk things through and render a judgment. It works beautifully in the context of criminal and civil law, so why not use it in the context of politics as well? as a source of policy recommendations, an accountability mechanism for elected officials, or why not, a new sort of legislative assembly. So this is the direction I want to put on the table, a deliberative democracy based on large-scale juries of ordinary citizens plucked at random from all classes of societies, across races, across divisions, brought together to talk to each other and reinvent a new form of politics. Stop there.
Awesome, thanks. It's good to be back here at UNC, in part because it's your fault I'm doing this. Literally, the reason I started working on this stuff was I was in a building here hanging with one of your former professors, Jeff Brennan, and we were talking, and he was like, you should write that up. So it's nice to like kind of return to my roots here for that very purpose. Should we have more democracy? You know, the problem with that question, it's a good question, but it's also too broad of a question, because what you're really asking is, should we have more democracy here, or what kind of democracy and where? After all, here's something that was very democratic. The Supreme Court recently got rid of Roe v. Wade and made abortion rights something that are decided at the level of the state legislature. They said, we, the super legislator who are not elected, aren't going to decide this anymore. We're going to have your elected representatives in your state legislature make this decision for you. That's more democratic than what we had before. Do you like it? Here's another thing that could be more democratic. We could have the state legislature of North Carolina decide everything that gets studied here. After all, they're spending all this money on this stuff. Who studies what, how much they study it, what views they take, what you get to study when you're a student. That would be more democratic, but it wouldn't be good. Now, I'm not saying that to like, just attack democracy, but I want you to realize the question, should we be more democratic or less democratic, is too simple. Really what we're asking is, should we try to fix democracy in certain ways, and would those ways actually work? Now, Hélène and I disagree on a lot of things, but we're actually both here to wag the finger at modern American democracy and French democracy and almost every other democracy in the world and go, you stink, stop it. Because we agree that there's real serious problems. We might disagree about what the solutions are, and we might disagree about how feasible some of these solutions are, but we agree on what many of these problems are. When I look at democracy, what I see is a massive incentive problem that's endemic to the system. And the problem is something like this. If you concentrate power in the hands of a very small number of people, those people will have a very strong incentive to use that power in a rational way for themselves. See Russia. If, on the other hand, you spread power out among the many, they don't have much of an incentive to think carefully about the way that they use that power, but they're more likely to be kind of nice about it and say big things. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to use it smartly. So we basically have the choice between concentrating power in the hands of the few, it's smart but mean and selfish, or spreading it out among the many and it's dumb but nice. Which one of those is better? I end up saying dumb but nice, but I think democracy is the best system that we have so far, but it has some real fatal flaws. And to see what those flaws are, just imagine that this is a class, and I'm a professor, and 15 weeks from now, you're all going to take a final exam. But I'm an egalitarian, and so what I'm going to do is average all of your grades together, and you will all get exactly the same score in that class based upon your final exam in 15 weeks. Would you study hard? No? But UNC students are so good, right? But you wouldn't. It wouldn't be, it's not because you're dumb. It's not because you're not capable of self-rule. It's because the incentive structure stinks. But what's going to happen next week is the United States is going to have a final exam with up to potentially 210 million people participating, though not quite that many actually will. And that exam is not just on philosophy, it's on criminology, on foreign policy, on trade policy, on everything you can think of all at once bundled together. Unsurprisingly, people don't study very much. They don't know. And this is one of the most common findings in political science, is that the typical voter knows next to nothing. They know who the president is in the US and not much else. They don't know who their party representatives are. They don't know which party controls Congress. They can't tell you what money is spent on what. They can't tell you what laws have been passed. They don't know even what their own party stands for. Instead, what they mostly do with politics is signal to one another. For instance, I notice many of you are wearing Carolina shirts. Why are you doing that? We all know you go to school here. You're here. The reason you're doing that, I'm not making fun of you, there's a reason why you're doing it. You're trying to show that you are committed. You're a loyal member of the UNC community, and good for you. And it works, by the way. Like, I see that you're wearing a UNC shirt. I'm like, I bet like you really care about this campus. Like, if I were here, I would want to be like your friend more than I want to be your friend, I guess, because you don't have the right kind of t-shirt. Sorry. Right? But what happens in modern American politics and around the world is we end up using politics as a way of creating teams that will fight each other. And one of the ways you show you're a good member of your team is by hating the other team as much as possible. You probably do that with that school down the street, right? With the Blue Devils. I'm from the Boston area, so we do that with the Yankees. We have a saying in Boston, which I won't repeat here, that ends with the Yankees and has a blank in the beginning. This is what we do in politics, and we do it because we have perverse incentives. So this is the main issue. Voters are ignorant and irrational and tribalistic because of the perverse incentives of democracy. We actually agree on that point. The question is, what do we do about it? Is there some way to improve our knowledge or at least extract more information from voters so we get higher quality decisions? Right? So if we ask more democracy, less democracy, this isn't really the right question. The question is better democracy. What would that be? Thank you.
All right, so for the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to ask questions. I'm going to start with some moderator questions, and then I invite all of you to submit questions. You have a way to do that. Your questions will come directly to my iPad, okay? And then I will screen them to make sure nobody's got a monologue or it's not ground that we've already covered. But I'm open to audience questions. We're going to start with the moderator questions. My first question, in considering this topic, does the U.S. need more or less democracy, or do we need better or different democracy, is to sort of do a diagnosis of what democracy looks like in the United States to start with. And maybe we want to do this in relative terms to the rest of the world, or maybe there's a checklist of aspects of democracy we meet or do not meet. But I'd like to hear first from the debaters, how much democracy do we have, or how healthy or unhealthy are we as a democracy?
Well, the US was downgraded a couple of years ago, right, after January 6th. It's not looking so wonderful at the moment. Can you hear me? Yeah. But I would say for me, the big worry is that we're not even meeting the basic bar of giving majorities what they want because they want it. What political scientists have measured is that, at one point, there's two political scientists, Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page, who measured that there was zero correlation between what majorities wanted and the policies that were enacted. Meaning that once you control for the preferences of rich people, can you hear me? I'm sorry, this is not
better.
Yeah, once you control for the preferences of the 10%, so the wealthiest 10% in the US, there was no apparent causal impact of majoritarian preferences on policies. So since then, the picture has become a little bit more nuanced, and it appears that majorities get what they want half the time. But it's not clear at all that they get what they want because they want it. It seems that most of the time they get it because some rich people want it. And so I'm just saying that that's the point that Ziblatt and Levitsky make, which is that this is minority rule. We've been stuck with minority rule de facto because of the Constitution, because of the way the demographics of the countries have evolved, etc. But it's not even meeting that minimal bar of majoritarian causal influence. So forget about the rest. It's really bad.
Is it really bad?
Yeah, it's really bad. The reality is, who runs the country? And the answer is my neighbors run the country. I live in the DC suburbs, and if I go like this when I'm staying outside of my house, I'm literally waving at the government. And not just because my congressperson lives down the street, but because I have a general over here, and I have State Department people over here, and other State Department people here. They're the ones that run the country. You don't have that much influence. And I'm actually more pessimistic about this stuff even than Hélène is, because I don't think there even is such a thing as what the majority wants. I don't think there is such a thing as even like what the typical person wants. So a good way of thinking about my neighborhood is if you drive around, you'll see these signs that say, in this house, we believe, and then it lists a bunch of stuff they don't believe. For instance, it says, we believe that no human being is illegal, but they don't actually advocate open borders. It's almost as if you're like driving through a neighborhood where almost everyone is an atheist, but they put up Christ is king signs. What really goes on with a lot of politics is we need to signal to one another that we're loyal members of our team. So what most people do when they join a political party is they join it on grounds having nothing to do with ideology, and then some of them, a minority of them, find out what that party stands for and just say they agree with it in order to make friends with other people on that team. And the reason they do that is because of the perverse incentives I was talking about before, because their votes don't make much of a difference. And for most people, all that matters in politics is not what policies you advocate, but how your neighbors and friends will react to you for joining one tribe or another.
Could we solve this problem with change to our parties? So if we had more parties, like some European countries and some countries around the world have more than two parties, two major parties, and there's more coalition seeking, would that be a solution, or are there more structural changes to decrease the animosity or the teams making that you're describing?
Yeah, I'll take that first if you don't mind. I think it would help if we had more parties. We're not ever going to do it for the reasons I'm about to explain, but part of the problem is when there's only two parties, it's really easy to just form a big coalition with one people and hate the other side and leave it at that. But on the other hand, if you have many, many parties, your ability to simply avoid anyone that you disagree with goes very far down, right? It's like it's easy for me to like never interact with someone on the other side if I want to. But if I were just one out of 30 major parties, I'd have to work with and live with and talk to and be friends with people who have different points of view. It's a commonly held view in political science that the reason we have two major political parties in the US is because we have what's called first past the post voting. If you eliminate first past the post voting and went with proportional representation, we would have more political parties and we'd have to talk to each other a little bit more. However, for what it's worth, the leaders of both political parties are well aware of the statistical law that leads to this, and they are not going to vote in change because they would lose their duopoly. So yes, we know how to fix it, and we also know it will not be fixed.
But would that be categorized as having more democracy to have more parties?
It's a good question. I would say that over the last 200 years, almost all advanced democracies have moved towards a system of proportional representation. So it seems to make politics a little bit more peaceful and less yield less frustration. So maybe it yields to more congruent policy outcomes that they match what majorities want more often. That said, there's a caveat there, because even if you have more coalitions, and so it's a more consensus-driven sort of politics, you lose accountability a little bit, because now everything happens among groups that strike deals, and you don't really know who to keep accountable. So on net, I think we're still far from an ideal of democracy whereby people feel like they're in charge, in control, and they know what's going on. It's still an elite game. That's what I mean.
Okay, so the democracy that we live with in the United States, our system of government, our political parties, those developed over time, given our history. In other parts of the world, democracies might look a little bit different. We've certainly tried to do what you might call nation building in some very different parts of the world, which brings me to my next question. Are there prerequisites to democracy? Are there some cultural or economic or social factors that are more compatible with democracy, or is democracy something that should be applied and institutionalized equally everywhere?
So I'm not technically a political scientist, so I can only sort of use the results by others. And my sense is that no one knows for sure. One thing I would say is that you do need rule of law and some basic sort of sense of stability, and it helps if you're wealthy, and it helps if you've, indeed have an educated, literate population, and all of that definitely helps. But I'm not sympathetic to the argument that says, well, we have to wait for people to be sufficiently educated before we start thinking about democracy, because historically it's always been the case that the education of the masses followed the fact of giving the masses the vote, right? Because then they vote for people who give them public education, and the elites will not naturally sort of educate the masses so that then they can also give them the vote. That just doesn't happen.
Prerequisites of democracy.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And empirically, we find, and I'm reporting other people's research like you are, you find that cultures that are very liberal in the philosophical sense of commitment to freedom do better with democracy than those that don't. Cultures where there's a very high interpersonal trust, generalized interpersonal trust. Do you think people will return your wallet if they find it? Do you trust people to keep their word? Or do you think they're likely to be liars? Cultures where there's a lot of trust tend to work better. so we've seen those correlations, but what the big debate in political science really is like, what causes what? Are these things mutually reinforcing? Does one come first and the others follow from it? And I don't think even in political science, anyone really knows the answer to that question.
So both of you alluded to this a little bit in your opening remarks, but I want to get to what the potential solutions might be. Or in other words, if not democracy, then what? Or if not the type of democracy that we have right now, then what? So could you both share a little bit more about what you think the next steps or solutions to some of the flaws? It seems like there's some area of agreement over where the shortcomings or flaws are, but let's talk a little bit about how do we fix the flaws in democracy? What are your proposed solutions?
So I'll expand a little bit on this idea of the jury as an inspiration for a new kind of institution. I think that there's something very appealing about the jury because it's something that everyone can have access to on the basis of lot. So it's one person, one lottery ticket. It's not like election that you need to win on the basis of often money, connections, charisma, ability to speak well, etc. So it's much more democratic selection mechanism, right? And then it's a school of democracy. You learn about government, you learn about a sense of responsibility, you learn about judging, etc. It's also a place where you will meet people that you would never meet in real life. People from completely different backgrounds, religion, ideology, race, etc. And you get to forge a bond through a deliberative process that can be quite arduous and lasting over time, etc. You get to learn about a topic. So I feel like this is a really good model for the kind of politics I was talking about, deliberative politics, a politics that is aiming to solve problems rather than win or assert power, right? And in fact, there's like a current now, it's called, there's a deliberative wave, it's called, of countries that have tried to implement jury-like bodies, so-called citizens' assemblies, quite large, actually, 60 to 100 to 185 people sometimes in the case of France, to spend time deliberating about very difficult issues from climate change to abortion to marriage equality to urban planning, and come up with recommendations. And in some cases, like in Ireland, the parliament has committed to taking seriously these recommendations and sending them to a referendum. And that's how they liberalized, they decriminalized abortion, for example, in Ireland in 2018, on the basis of a referendum that followed the recommendation that came out of a citizens' assembly. In France, we had an assembly on climate justice. So Macron tried to pass a carbon tax to curb our CO2 emissions that triggered an immediate social backlash, the so-called yellow vest movements. So he said, okay, you don't like my solution, you find a better one. And he convened 150 randomly selected citizens for 9 months, beautiful palace next to the Eiffel Tower. And they had access to experts, they talked to each other. And they came up with 149 solutions, none of which included a carbon tax. And that yielded, through a parliamentary process, the 2021 Climate and Resilience Law, which is the most ambitious law we've ever had on something like climate. So it's very inspiring in the beginning of something. There are all kinds of limitations to the process and objections one can raise, but I think it's a new kind of politics that I'm excited about.
Yeah, there's many things we could do. And one thing would be maybe to devolve politics down more to the local level where people have a stronger incentive to know what they're talking about to actually solve problems. But the reality is we can't do that for everything, right? So what about the things we need to do on a large national level? What if we need to have something like an election and so on? Ideally, what we would do is we'd have an informed public. We don't know how to do that. It's very depressing. We know that education has a very weak effect on how much people know. Even going from like a bachelor's degree, having a high school diploma to a bachelor's degree predicts that you'll get about one extra question right on something called a Pew poll, which tests political knowledge. We don't really know how to make people better informed. So what I want to know is there a way to sort of simulate having an informed public? So this is a far out idea. It's something I like to experiment with. I'm not saying it's a panacea, and I'm not saying I know it would work. It's like something I like to experiment with. What if on election day, or whatever it is we're voting on, when you vote, you do three things. First, you tell us who you are. You get information about who you are as a person, your income, your race, and things like that. The second thing is we find out what you want, right? What are you voting for? And the third thing is we have you take a quiz, which I actually would use
a deliberative form of the type that Hélène is talking about to write. I ask 500 random citizens to write a quiz where they tell me what counts as an informed voter according to you, which could mean you know who the president is or you know what the price of milk is. They take this quiz and now we know who they are, what they want, and what they know. If we have this for thousands or tens of thousands or millions of people, we can statistically estimate what would the public have voted for if it were demographically identical but perfectly informed. We can simulate having an informed public even though we're not actually an informed public. This is actually a method that political scientists and economists around the world have been using for decades to try to figure out things like how do different factors affect what people vote for. But I think we could try to use it as a method of governance. I wouldn't put this in for like the presidential election next week and try, but I would like to see maybe a relatively uncorrupt state like New Hampshire, or a relatively non-corrupt country like Denmark experiment with this, and then if it works, scale up. So that would be one of my possible ideas. Does it work? We don't know. We'd have to try it.
Okay, so I have a few more questions. One of them is a very ivory tower question, so a very philosophical question. Brace for that. And then I want to ask a couple questions about the election next week because this topic is so relevant. And then I'm going to turn to audience questions, so don't forget to submit those. My ivory tower question, just based on what you've described as your potential solutions, is your view, Dr. Landemore, one that that depends on a view of human nature that is more positive, would you say? Because as I listen to you describe a citizens' assembly or a jury, people are actively listening, people are acting in good faith. This seems like a very good person, a very good type of interaction that people might have with one another. And, you know, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So I'm curious if a pro-democracy view depends, in your opinion, on a higher view of mankind or human nature. And then same question in reverse to Dr. Brennan, is a negative view or critical view of democracy one where you want to select for, you know, the people who have the most knowledge, the most information, who can make the best decisions in the electorate? Is that one that has a more negative view of human nature or our ability to govern ourselves? So this is an ivory tower question, but I want to know where these feelings about democracy might take root in a view about human nature or not.
It's a good question. I don't think it demands a very thick definition of human nature. I would say you just need to assume that people are rational, have common sense, and are moderately sociotropic, care enough about other people. But, you know, in the context of a jury, yes, you still need to respond positively. That's the first thing, where you'd have to be a little sociotropic, willing to devote time to something that's, you know, not paid well, that takes time, etc. But once you're in the jury, my experience, and, you know, it's based on interviews of people who've done these things, the rewards are intrinsic to the process. People love it. People are transformed by it. It's really the opposite of politics as we experience it right now, which is, you know, making you feel dirty and it makes you want to flee. Whereas this is rewarding because you connect with people, you learn, you're taken seriously, you're not judged on, you know, you're not prejudged. Oh, you know, Trump voter, oh, this, you know, like, or liberal. No, you're judged as your you know, Mitchell from Nevada, and that's it. That's who you are, and friendships are born between very different people. And there's a wonderful movie that I always return to, 12 Angry Men, where you know, these people are portrayed as very flawed and some of them angry human beings, but by the end there's something that happens that is transformative of even the angriest one. And so I highly recommend that you take a look at that movie. It should remind you of the value to jury context as an institution.
Human nature.
Yeah, human nature. I think I just have a realistic view of human nature. When you create a collective action problem, you get a collective action problem. If you create a system in which your individual decision making, all the costs are borne by other people, you're likely to externalize lots of those costs. And you can see this yourself firsthand. What's my view of human nature? I haven't been in a UNC bathroom in a dormitory at like Sunday night, but I'm going to guess that they're kind of gross. Is that right? At the end of a long weekend, are they kind of gross? Are the communal kitchens, do they tend to get pretty gross? Terrible? Do you guys take it upon yourselves to clean those kitchens on behalf of everybody else? Like you're like, their kitchen's gross, I'm gonna clean it before anyone else comes in. Do you do that? Some people do, yeah. A few people do. I poll my students about this all the time. It's usually like 1 out of 50 that'll do it. I actually have to do this as an activity to see what it's like. If it turned out that like your grades depended upon other people's work, like would you study? Probably not, right? Do we have climate change problems? Yeah, et cetera, et cetera. When you create a system in which people can externalize the cost of their decision onto other people, that's what they have a tendency to do. They tend to make bad decisions. I don't think that's because people are bad. I think it's because the system is bad. It's true that angels wouldn't act that way, but even pretty good people would, because you don't know what you can expect from other people. You don't have assurance that they're going to do their part. I mean, think back to that classroom metaphor. Imagine I'm in Biology 101 and there's 15 weeks before you take the final exam, and I really want to study as hard as possible so I get 100 out of 100 on that test. I'm still going to get the same grade as everybody else. I would study if only I had the assurance that other people would as well. But we don't have that assurance. You know they're not studying. So what do you, and if you then decide not to study, it's not because you're a bad person. It's because you have bad incentives.
I'm going to turn to next week's election. So just 6 days from now, we will decide many things as a country, not just who the next president will be, but as states, we will make decisions. And I'm visiting tonight from where I now live in the state of Colorado. And it was quite a big change moving from my home state of North Carolina to Colorado. When elections came around, my ballot that I received in the mail, we have all mail-in ballots in Colorado, it was about 6 pages long this year, front and back. So I've got many amendments, initiatives, ballot questions, referenda to vote on, in addition to candidates for public office. And so my impression of Colorado is that it's relatively democratic because we have so many direct democracy measures. And so I wanted to ask our panelists tonight about these direct democracy measures in various US states. Do you know how the states compare when it comes to direct democracy? And are direct democracy efforts linked to any particular ideological outcomes in general? Or are they kind of a level playing ground for people of all different ideologies to get their potential policies on the ballot?
So actually, direct democracy in the US is very impressive. I think it's a country at the level of states. I think it's second to none except Switzerland in terms of like the frequency, the scope, etc. So it's actually very we forget because at the federal level there's no direct democracy mechanism. Even electing the president is indirect, but at the local level there's really a long sort of deep tradition of direct democracy, which, as far as I can tell from, again, studies by political scientists, like this economist, John Matsusaka, who wrote a book called Let the People Rule, he sees mostly good things coming out of this tradition of direct democracy and frequent votes. It's the same in Switzerland, actually. It's the same in Uruguay, which has a better rating in terms of democracy than the US currently, in part because it imported those referendum and citizens' initiative practices from Switzerland. They copied it straightforwardly from the Swiss constitution. So I think those things are excellent and we should build on them. They do run into the problem that Jason is obsessed with, which is the question of, okay, how does that work at scale? Because in large-scale referenda, nobody has an incentive to vote, which is true at the theoretical level, because if in practice, people do vote, right? It's one of those somewhat false problems sort of concocted by philosophers, because there's a paradox of voting that is solved in practice. People do go out and vote. Why? Because even if indeed as an individual level, you don't have the incentive. In fact, you have all sorts of micro communities. Your family first. Did you vote? The people at the city hall who give you a hot dog or a bottle of water or a sticker. Like there are these things that still keep people involved enough that they keep the machinery going. So there are answers to your objection, I think. That maintain the worth of direct democracy mechanisms. So I just want to say that I think it's still a tradition. It's just not deliberative enough for my taste, right? So one thing I really like, it's in Oregon, actually. I have a colleague, John Gastill, who's been running this citizens initiative reviews. They consist in asking a random sample of citizens, usually 25, I think, so it's a very small jury, to basically write up their evaluation of something that's on the ballot, the pros and the cons. And they hand that, it's written by people like us, like peers, citizens, fellow citizens. So you're handed this little pamphlet, and you can read the pros and cons, and you can sort of go in with an informed opinion as opposed to the propaganda that parties are going to peddle to you, right? And it sort of worked really well for a couple of years.
Well, she kind of argued your point for you, but you might have more to say about direct democracy. Do you?
I think you got this question.
Okay, okay, great. Because my personal experience as a voter, it's both a great privilege to vote directly on policy outcomes, but it's also a great responsibility. And so I've yet to vote because I've still got to study more. I have to do a lot of studying. And I guess one of my concerns is are all the other voters studying and taking this as seriously as I am? Maybe they are. I don't know. I'm not inside of each of their homes where they're doing their voting. I'm going to ask one last moderator question, and then I see some great questions on here. So thank you for submitting some excellent questions. My last question, because I feel I would be remiss to talk about what's going on in our presidential politics right now. Democrats, the Democratic Party, have made democracy a central focus of their campaigning and their pitch to voters about why they believe Kamala Harris should be the president and why President Trump is what they've described as a threat to democracy. And so I'm curious to hear from our panelists about what the implications for democracy could be in your view of next week's presidential election. One specific thing I'd ask you to comment on is during President Trump's first term, maybe his only term, but during his term in office as the 45th president, he instituted a rule reclassifying many federal workers as political appointees, meaning he could more easily fire them or replace them, and they became, accountable to him. And some people argue this degrades our democracy because it reduces this sort of independent workforce, the federal workforce. But then some people argue that this should actually be a change for the better democracy-wise, because you're moving federal workers into a place where they're accountable to the president, who's the only person in the executive branch who stands for election. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that item specifically, but if you have more broad thoughts about next week's election, please share.
Great. As far as I can tell, as a person who's not a Democratic Party or Republican Party partisan, for both members, the typical member of both parties, something is democratic if and only if it goes our way. Right. And that happens even among philosophers as well. I have a good friend who's a prominent Democratic theorist. I won't name him by name, but whenever the other side wins, he can always find a reason why it wasn't really democratic, and it was because of something flawed in the system. Right. And he often has a point. There is often a flaw. I think regardless what happens, you're going to see both like the other side saying that something corrupt happened, and they're going to point fingers and say it's not legitimate and unfair. And the reason I think they're going to do that is because since I've been paying attention to politics, that's what they do, and they get worse about it every year. And that's not to say bad things haven't happened. Like I know bad things have, but that's just what they do. They are constantly trying to delegitimize each other and say that the other side doesn't have the right to rule. So I think that's really problematic. I don't think we're going to get any kind of rectification of that. What was the second half of the question, though?
I was asking about the change of federal workers to political appointees.
Yeah, that's right. So this is another example of those questions, like, should things be more democratic? In Ohio, for instance, in certain other states, you often have democratically elected judiciary members, like judges who don't have a law degree and no background in law can be just directly elected by the people. That's more democratic in one particular sense. Is it a good thing? It's not obvious. It is literally the case that the typical, when Bill Clinton, the dearly beloved son of Georgetown University, Bill Clinton became president, about a few months in, he was interviewed by a prominent newscaster about what the biggest surprise was about being president. And he said, how little power we really have, right? That was his answer, because he had this bureaucracy he couldn't control, right? He couldn't eliminate that. He had jobs for life. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Right? I bet if you don't like Donald Trump, you think it's a bad thing, or it's a good thing that he can't control. And if you do like him, you probably think it's a bad thing, right? Because what people usually mean by democracy is when I get my way. So that's a great question. Should we have an independent judiciary? Should we have an independent bureaucracy that's not forced to just do what the politicians say? That's a great question. But it's going to depend a lot on your view about whether you want people to be directly accountable to the people, indirectly accountable to the people, or if you think it's important that there be some positions in which people just know what they're doing and they're not being told what to do.
So I'm a little more worried about the elections, because I do think there's an asymmetry between the two camps. I think on the Republican side, there's been, and on the from Trump himself, there's been, a refusal to commit to the procedures by which the election is supposed to be settled. And so I do worry about a breakdown of democratic expectations, norms, and all these things that keep us engaged in the same sort of game. That's a minimal amount of you need for democracy. It's not even democracy, it's just the rule of law. Like, if that's not like a given, anything's possible. That's what I worry about. The fact that we had January 6th before, the incitement to violence, people died. I mean, this might have been just a rehearsal. So I don't know. I don't want to be an alarmist, and there are enough people who are alarmists out there, but I do sense that we're at a very unusual inflection point in American history, and I'm more worried about one side than the other. Even as I think the other side, for me, it's just a continuation of the oligarchic plutocracy. So it's not a good choice. It's not a good choice, but one is gonna at least allow us to continue with the known rules of the game. The other is a jump in the unknown. That's what I fear.
There's a question for you from our audience. So I'm going to start with a question for Dr. Landemore, and this is an audience question specifically about how you gauge the success of a democracy. But I'll read the full question so that you have the background from this audience member. You cite modern democracy's trend of moving towards proportional representation as a good thing by making democracy more peaceful/friendly. How do you measure the success of a democracy? Can a successful democracy be violent/highly defensive of their positions?
What's the success of a democracy or any polity, really? Rousseau used to measure it by the number of births. If people are willing to have families, that's a good sign. We have other standards. It's welfare levels, it's education level. It's I would say, participation level in the political system is also a sign of contentment with the system. So polls tell us that Americans, I think 2/3 of Americans think the system is corrupt. That's not a good sign. That's not going well. That I would take seriously as a sign of democratic backsliding and crisis. And it's been like this for a long time now. So it's almost become a norm. So I don't know what we can use as measurements of like things going well, but I think we know what counts as things going poorly. Right.
I have a question for you, Dr. Brennan. Someone from the audience wants you to offer your critique of Dr. Landemore's proposed alternative jury-like system. So I fear that I went too quickly during that solutions-oriented portion of our discussion, but I would love to hear, and so would this audience member who writes, both you and Dr. Landemore agree that the current state of American democracy is not successful. Dr. Landemore proposed the alternative jury-like system. What's your response to her alternative?
Well, I hope she's right. And if she is right, then I hope we do more of it because we do need alternatives. So I think it's great that people keep studying it. That said, I'm pretty critical of many of these studies. And I'll give you a metaphor for this. We were talking about beforehand how your kid does musical theater, my kid does musical theater, you did musical theater, right? We were all into that. And I go to many musical theater shows, some of which are really wonderful and everyone's really talented. But some of the theater things my kids participate in, it's like there'll be like 30 people up on stage and 4 of them can sing and 3 of them can act. But nevertheless, when they walk away, all the parents go, that was really wonderful. Like Timmy did a great job. And it's like, no, Timmy didn't do a good job. He was actually really bad. Like you maybe should consider him having to do soccer instead. This is not his thing, right? He can't sing. He doesn't seem to have any sense of rhythm. He can't dance and he doesn't act. He just reads his line. But the parents are like, no, it's really wonderful. And when I read a lot of the political science literature and philosophers talking about deliberative democracy, I think they're doing that kind of thing. It's like you've got 30 studies that come out and sometimes the results are like, first of all, there's a bias towards having positive results. That's just true of every field, right? It's not special to political science. Like positive results get published, they're often replicable. That's why there's a replication crisis in psychology. There's a bias towards that, the good kind of results. And then oftentimes the results that they show are like super unimpressive. I'm like, oh, that's it? That's like, this is why this is the savior of like the world, this deliberative democracy thing. I read the same study and you're like, wow. And I'm like, oh, I would write that as a critique of deliberative democracy. So I'm worried that, and then, these are often things done in laboratories or they're done on a small scale or they're done in one-off things. And are they really things we can scale up? I'm worried about that. So I'm willing to be convinced, but the things I've been given so far make me go, keep doing that work, but I'm not on your side yet.
No, I'll grant that there's not enough empirical studies out there of these new forms of politics and deliberative politics. But as we try more, we'll have more evidence, hopefully. So that's a bit of a chicken and egg regress. I would say that French parents are not like that. They would tell you that little Tim did terrible, and they would not praise as much. So yeah. Anyway, I think remember that when the founding fathers created the republic, they had zero empirical evidence for almost none of the institutional choices. So we're in a much better position today. At least we have some studies. At least we have some, game theoretical idea of what could happen if we do this or if we do that. We have some form models. We're in a much better position.
I have a follow-up question about the jury model, because I have an experience. I've served once upon a time on a task force in the state of Colorado, which may be very different because we were appointed and we were not randomly selected. But one of my experiences was that there were arguments that some members of the task force would make about what this policy should look like that were very compelling and that applied a lot of social pressure to other members of the task force to take those arguments very seriously. So arguments that depend on values like empathy or care for the least of these. These were arguments that despite some policy disagreements I might have had with my fellow task force members, I thought those were great arguments. And meanwhile, other values that we have to weight against some of these values that Jonathan Haidt, who might say these are moral foundations that are more common among the political left, are considerations like, gosh, how much is this going to cost taxpayers? And that's not an argument that a lot of people find very persuasive. It doesn't pull at the heartstrings. It doesn't, compared to helping Sally, who has a need, the cost to taxpayers just doesn't sound like that compelling of an argument. So one of my questions about the jury-like deliberative system that you're proposing is, does the sort of social decision-making model of a group conversation about a policy decision, does that come with some kind of inherent bias towards particular values?
It's a great question. Actually, I cannot prove it. I think, again, Jason's right, there's not enough empirical studies out there, but I don't think it's inherently partisan in its outcome. I'll give you several examples. So it's true, I mentioned the Irish Citizens' Assemblies, whose outcomes leaned liberal. It favored marriage equality for gay couple. It favored decriminalization of abortion. But then again, this was a very punitive constitution before they liberalized it. It's not like it's super permissive now. But then in other cases where they've used citizens' assemblies, for example, on nuclear energy in South Korea, the citizens decided against the liberal option of halting the construction of nuclear power plants. They said, no, this is ridiculous. This green ideology, it's all very nice, but our economy cannot sustain it, so we're going to continue them. And they made that recommendation against the preference of the president who had convened the Citizens' Assembly. Then again, in Texas, when they had a deliberative poll on green energies, they completely flipped from oil to green energies. And by the way, that's why Texas is today a leader in green energies, because of this it's not a Citizens' Assembly, it was a deliberative poll that convinced citizens and the politicians who were there that actually, you know what, we have a lot of wind, we have a lot of sun, why don't we become leaders in that? So I think it can go many ways.
Great, thank you for entertaining my follow-up question. Another audience question, I thought this topic might come up, but someone has asked about the talk of our democracy in the United States when we are in fact a republic. Any comment on that mashup?
David Hume, the historian and philosopher, wrote a book called The Treatise of Human Nature, and the subtitle was On the Introduction of the Experimental Method in Philosophy. And what he meant by the word experiment in the 1700s is what you would mean by the word observation. right? Similarly, the word democracy had a slightly different meaning in 1792 in the United States than it has now. In 1792, like when, like what it meant was a degenerate form of the rule of the many, because that's the way Aristotle was using the word. And we were going to use constitutional polity or republic to mean a not degenerate form of the rule of the many. And because of just weird things that have happened in language over time, languages evolve. Now the word democracy is used in political science and philosophy as an umbrella term, where degenerate, majoritarian, unconstrained democracy is a form of democracy. And what you mean by republic is also a form of democracy. Literally nothing is at stake. That's it. It's just how people use the words, and you can feel free to use the words however you want. Is the United States a republic in the sense of being a constrained democracy with a liberal Bill of Rights? Yeah. Yeah, it is. Is it a democracy? It is democracy the way that we use the word, and it's not the way democracy in the way that Jefferson used the word. No, not a problem with Jefferson, not a problem with me. Everything's cool.
Actually, I disagree a little bit, because I think what they meant by republic, and they really meant to distinguish it from rule by the people. And I think whether directly or indirectly, actually, so the representation distinction, I'm not sure it's that crucial. I think they wanted something more like a mixed regime with, an aristocratic component, a monarchical component, and a popular component. And that, to me, is not what we mean today, what we should mean today by democracy. And if that's what we still mean by democracy, I think that explains a lot of our problems. Because a real democracy has, in my view, is centering a sovereign legislative power, and the other powers are subordinated to that. Not so there's a whole question about whether even the doctrine of checks and balances is compatible with that, because the doctrine of checks and balances consists in giving some legislative power to the executive and some legislative power to the Supreme Court, and then you end up with a mess, because you have an expansion of the powers of each branch. And so anyway, so I think it's a more complicated story. It's a good question, because it's worth asking the question regularly.
Thank you. I've got a couple questions that I'm going to ask at the same time, because they both are questions about the implications of democracy on the type and size of government we have, or the economic system that we have. So I'm going to ask both these questions, and maybe Dr. Landemore, if you want to answer first. How can a form of more democracy, where the minority do not rule, exist in such a capitalist society? Is that even possible? And a similar question, do you think there is a relationship between democracy and the amount of government we have, i.e. libertarian versus communist society? So do you think that there are implications of having more or less democracy on the type and size of government that we have, and then also on the economic system that we have, or are those just completely separate considerations?
That's more a question for Jason, this question of the scope of government. Because in theory, a democracy could choose to have more or less government. So I feel like there's no reason why it would necessarily have more of it, right? The question of is democracy compatible with capitalism? I've come to conclude that not really. If by capitalism we mean an economy where only shareholders are represented on the governance of companies and have a say, I don't think it's entirely compatible, no. I think that it creates too many economic inequalities that then translate into capture of government by economic forces, disproportionate influence of lobbies that serve the interest of corporations that only serve the interest of shareholders. So there's like all kinds of like chains and effects that I think are connected that really make a real meaningful democracy very difficult. That said, I think an improvement over the existing system would actually to empower shareholders more than they currently are empowered, because we don't even have shareholder democracy at the moment. Shareholders have the exact problem that Jason described. I think it applies more to shareholders than to voters in a democracy. They're completely disparate and not connected, and very few of them actually use their voting rights. So basically, asset managers and corporation managers do whatever they want. they don't necessarily represent the interests of the shareholders that well. And when it comes to, so actually, I just learned that Norway, which has the biggest wealth fund in the world, civil society groups are going to convene in January a citizens' assembly to deliberate about what this wealth fund should do with its money. Because right now, who decides? A bunch of managers who are unaccountable to absolutely anyone. But the money actually belongs to the country, right? It's generated by the oil that they found in the 60s. And so don't the shareholders, meaning the citizens in this case, have a right to say what they want to do with this money? And to the credit of Norwegians, they really feel bad about making so much money. They're making a ton of money since the Ukraine war, and they feel like they owe something to the world. And so hence this project of trying to think about, okay, what do we do with all that money?
Capitalism and democracy.
If you have a really extreme form of democracy and a really extreme form of capitalism, you can define them in a way where these words can't quite match up. But the way we find the actual world is that democracy and capitalism tend to be found together. There's a tight correlation between them. You can Google Economic Freedom of the World Index by the Simon Fraser Institute, and a map will come up on your computer or laptop or whatever you have that will show you how capitalist countries are. The blue ones are the most capitalist. And you'll be like, oh, those are all the democracies plus a couple non-democracies, I guess. In fact, there's a very persistent and strong correlation between how market-oriented a country is and how democratic it is. But at the same time, it is true that at the extreme, these things are going to have a lot of tension. So yeah, empirically speaking, these things tend to come and go together. That's what we find, and there's reasons for that. As far as like what makes markets in a sense work, it's not because of shareholder power. Like, you know, when you think of who owns different companies, it's like I have a lot of money in stock, like mutual funds, which then indirectly own like, you know, certain companies. And like, you know, the mutual funds that I'm part of, like a lot of professors are ones that are like, it's a cooperative and I never vote on any of that stuff. They send me my ballot every year and I throw it in the trash and I don't even open it, right? And I even know some things about finance when I ever bother. It's true, I don't bother. But do you know what makes the things work is the corporations have to compete against each other and they have market forces, and the more competitive the market is, the less dumb they can be before they go out of business. A good way to illustrate this is just imagine you have the choice between two things. One gives you voice and one gives you exit. In town one, all of you are in this town, you all are forced to eat at the same restaurant for every single meal. You can't go anywhere else, but you're allowed to complain to the manager as much as possible. In this town over here, there's 50 different restaurants for you to choose from. You can go to whatever one you want, but you never get to complain about your meal ever. Which town has better food? That one or that one? It's that one, right? Like exit beats voice. That's what happens. The problem with democratic governance is we don't have much exit. If I want to move, like imagine I'm just really fed up with the United States and I'm like, I'm sick of it, I'm out of here. It would be really hard for me to move to another country and go live there. And for me, I'm actually one of the Americans with the easiest time moving to another country. I've actually come close to doing it a few times, not because I have a problem with the US, but just hasn't worked out that way, right? It's easy for me to move and it's still really hard. Most of you cannot move to another country if you want to and live there full time because they won't let you. And similarly, most people who want to come here can't move here because we won't let them. We're closer to being this system where you can complain as much as you want, but you're still going to eat at that same restaurant than we are to a system in which there's 50 restaurants and you can choose which one that you want, right? That's why shareholder stuff in governance of corporations doesn't matter that much. What actually matters is the competition of market forces. We don't have a similar disciplining mechanism on states because most people are stuck living in whatever state that they're born in. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, but nevertheless, the mechanism that makes markets work is not present in democratic governance.
So just one thing, I wanted to distinguish between free markets and capitalism. I think those two things are different. And if you look at Germany, for example, it's not strictly speaking capitalist because who has power in large corporations? It's more or less evenly divided between the shareholders, the representative of the shareholders, and the representatives of the workers, right? Because since the Second World War, they made it mandatory. They constitutionalized the necessity for large corporations over 5,000 employees to have worker representation at the level of the board of administrators. So what I'm saying is that what we call capitalist societies, oftentimes they're kind of like also very socialist in some respect, and they have democracy in the workplace, right? In Germany, that's the case. So just to say that it's not the same. The free market is one thing that I'm absolutely in favor of, but the capitalist component, the only power to the shareholders, it doesn't have to be so restrictive. There are other models. The German model is one.
Your restaurant competition example sounded a lot like a defense of free market system. Do you want to offer any further defense of a capitalist system or differentiate?
No, I think it might just be that we're using, she's using capitalist in
Yes,
a more loaded way than I am, and that's all. I don't think there's anything really substantive there.
Okay, great. I want to ask a question about education and how it relates to being a democratic society or having institutionalized democracy. It's becoming more widespread that civics is being taught in high school. Do you think that this will help voters be more informed in the future, or do you think that the content that's being taught in such classes will fail to promote more informed voters?
I think it will fail. And the reason I think it will fail is because it always fails. We've been doing it a lot and it always fails. It doesn't work, right? We know it doesn't work. We know why it doesn't work. Citizens actually are taught in K through 12 education in the US, like they're exposed to, taught's the wrong word, that's a success word. They're exposed to a lot of what they need to do to be informed voters, and then they forget it all. Right? We know this. We have tests of this. We've had them for 70 years. We can see how much civics education people get, and then we can see how much they remember afterwards. And the answer is really close to zero. Even as I said before, going from having a high school diploma to having a bachelor's degree predicts that on a 30-question battery of basic political knowledge, you will get one extra question right. One, right? Maybe this is a good school. Maybe here it'd be like 1.2, but like, on average 1. And the reason is because of something called rational ignorance. How many of you have got an A on a final exam that you would fail if you took it right now? Okay. Uh-oh, should we rescind your degree? No, like you forget this stuff. Like you learn it for the thing and like for the test, and then you forget it afterwards. I was a chemistry major for a long time, and I'm not really sure I remember what a ketone is anymore. Right? People are like, hey, remember that article you wrote back in 2012 about blah, blah, blah? I'm like, no, I don't remember that. Right? Do you remember like your phone number of your best friend in high school anymore? Probably not. Right? We forget all this stuff because it doesn't pay off to remember it. People tend to know things if and only if the benefits of the knowledge exceed the costs. And for most people, the costs of this political knowledge are higher than the benefits, and so they forget everything. We've been trying to spend money on civics education for a long time, and if we doubled it, tripled it, and so on, it still wouldn't make a difference. It's not money well spent. In fact, actually, the only schooling system, by the way, that seems to have a good effect on civics knowledge in the US are Catholic schools. For some reason, they're pretty good at it, and they get higher than normal scores and higher than normal results. Everyone else stinks at it. So if somebody says, I want to spend $100 billion on civics education, don't vote for them. Spend it on something else because it's not going to work. It's not because knowledge doesn't matter. It's just that it doesn't work. And there's a lot of things like this, by the way. Like, for instance, how many of you are required to take a class on freshman composition, right? Like to make you a better writer. Guess what? There's hundreds of studies of those things, and they say those classes don't make you better writers, right? So there's lots of stuff like that. Don't spend your money on this. Find something else. Education is not going to fix the problem because it's not responding to what the problem is. Rational ignorance.
So I actually happen to agree with you on that one, and I'm confused now as to why you want to make people take a test that basically measures a totally dead form of knowledge that is not in context, that is not mobilized in the context of solving a problem. So it seems to sort of contradict what you recommend. I mean, anyway, the point is that in terms of increasing a sense of civic commitment, there are other ways to do it. For example, in Bolivia, Adam Cronkite has run these experiments where he went to high schools and introduced the principle of random selection to select class delegates. And that sort of brought out the shy, the people who would never have run for class delegate elections in a million years. And they measured up to the occasion, and they found in themselves leadership skills that they didn't know they had. This seems to me much more interesting than trying to sort of teach content to people. It reminds me of the way I learned about the Socratic method in France. I learned about it from a top-down lecturer, and I was taking note the whole time. It took me going to the US and actually engaging in a seminar format where you were forced to speak up and think on your feet to learn what the Socratic method actually is. So that to me is how you teach people. You have to bring them out, like not just lecture at them.
Well, I know I've been learning a lot
which
from
we've
this
been doing.
conversation tonight. It is time for us to turn to our closing remarks. Before we do that, I want to remind everyone that we will be taking a post-debate poll. So I'm reminding you during the closing statements or sometime as we near the end here, you may vote again if you agree, disagree, or don't know. If you agree, disagree with, does the US need more democracy? So we'll start with closing remarks now, about 5 minutes each, and we'll start with you, Dr. Landemore.
All right. Well, I just wanted to reiterate this plea to really take seriously the idea of the jury as a new model for a new kind of democracy. The way I like to think of it now is an instantiation of the motto of the French Revolution, actually. You know, liberty, equality, fraternity. Does it work?
I think maybe get
So it's liberty, because it really puts in your hands the decision and sort of educates you to take responsibility for perhaps legislation, perhaps just policy recommendations. It's transformative in that way. Equality, because again, anyone can be chosen to be part of a jury or a citizens' assembly. You don't have to be good looking, you don't have to be a good speaker, you don't have to have connection, you don't have to have money. Anyone is in theory a candidate for a position in a citizens' assembly. And fraternity, I wanted to mention that because that's the thing that surprised me the most when I actually went to observe citizens' assemblies in France. It's the emotional dimension, the bond that was created between people, the friendship I saw emerge between, you know, people on the left and on the right, young people, older people, you know, a very proper retired banker and a tattooed butcher. And like, so this kind of like connection that would no longer happen in real life because we live in segregated neighborhoods. We only marry people like us. I read that Republicans won't marry Democrats anymore and vice versa. So we're at a point where people are talking about the possibility of a civil war. So there's a movie about that. So it's in the air, right? That there's so much hatred and distrust. And I think we desperately need something that brings us back together, talking to each other, engaging with each other, respecting each other, even liking each other, perhaps even, and that would be a stretch, but that's what I've seen in this assembly is people loving each other. So that's my hope, is that we can do something different and that we can do it before it's too late. Thank you.
Thanks. You know, Hélène and I both agree that a better functioning democracy would be better than a poorly functioning democracy. We both agree that in many respects, the democracies we see around the world are functioning quite poorly. We disagree to how we're going to solve them and to what degree we can solve them. But I think we should maybe take a step back and ask some bigger questions about what do we mean by more democracy in the first place? And what are the deeper, bigger alternatives? Rather than just fixing forms of government, what else can we do? And I'll share you an example that I use. Some of you heard this already when you were meeting with us prior to this in a different event. I went to Nando's Peri Peri yesterday for lunch. And a couple of years ago, Nando's Peri Peri had a little stunt they did with regard to the last election where they said, we're going to have what's called an anti-democratic meal. And if you want, you can order it. And the way it would work is you'd walk in and you'd order something and you'd say, I'll take the anti-democratic meal. And then they would send it to people in the back who would like just put a bunch of ingredients together in a completely disgusting way, like mayonnaise on top of a brownie with like a side of, like, I don't know, Sprite spilled on top of it or something like that. And they go, would you like this? And you're like, that's gross. Like, that's what an anti-democratic meal is, right? Because it's sort of like the evil dictator is just giving you garbage you don't want to eat, right? And the democratic meal sounds better than that. But notice they didn't actually offer people an alternative of a democratic meal. What would a democratic meal be? A democratic meal would be you go to Nando's Peri Peri and you order whatever it is you want, and then they ignore you and ask the majority what they want, and then you get whatever the majority stands for, right? Imagine you had a democratic Spotify account, all right? Would that be great for you? Would you like that? Like, there's any here, like, think of like the music I listen to. I really like Swedish progressive death metal. Anyone into that? Oh, like one other person, like Opeth, yeah, right? Scar symmetry, like, there's enough of us in the world that can be an actual thing, right? I don't really like Taylor Swift. No problem with her. It's just not my thing. Like, I'm happy for all of her success. And if you love her, good for you. I really mean that honestly, but it's not my thing, right? I like really spicy food. You all like really spicy food? Few of you, like, we're in North Carolina. You guys like it more than like Ohio, but like, not enough of you. All right. I like to listen, like, I like movies with a sense of persistent dread. Do you guys like that? No. So the problem is that's just personal preferences. But when it comes to, we make a thing political, when we make it a collective decision, what we're doing is inherently creating a system in which a lot of people are going to be disappointed because there's going to be one solution for everyone. One size fits all. Everyone's going to listen to the same thing. We're all going to eat the same. We're all going to do the same thing. That's the inherent problem with democracy and all of politics, period, right? So it's not giving you personal choice. It's about what we decide. So one of the things we have to ask ourselves is really, what is the proper scope of a democracy? Which decisions have to be made political? Can we avoid making them political in the first place? If we have to make them political, can we make them political on a smaller scale? Because it's much more likely that my neighbors and I are going to agree about something about the things that we live with than people across the country or across the world are going to agree. Right? These are the real big problems with asking, should we have more democracy? Should we have less? We both agree we should have better democracy. We both agree that democracy is effective as we find it in the world. We both think that there's certain experiments and things we should try out to see if we can improve these problems. But fundamentally, it's too simple of a question, should we have more or less? What we really need to be thinking about is, how little politics can we get by with in the first place? And how much can we make it more about you decide for yourself and you decide for yourself and you decide for yourself rather than we decide for everybody? So thank you.
Thank you. We've had excellent discussion, excellent panelists. I'd like to review the results of our poll so we can put those up there. I'd also like to thank the Program for Public Discourse, Carolina Liberty Foundation, and the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation for sponsoring tonight's debate. I'd like to thank all of our foundation sponsors, all of our supporters tonight for their support of the Campus Liberty Tour. You can see the votes are still coming in. This feels like election night on CNN or Fox News or whatever your channel of choice. Dramatic inputs here. Great, thank you to everyone who voted. If you enjoyed this evening's debate, we ask that you visit steamboatinstitute.org, and if you're able, make a tax-deductible contribution to allow us to host more debates. Be sure to subscribe to the Steamboat Institute's YouTube channel, and if you can't come in person to our next debate, listen on the live stream. Thank you, everybody, and have a good night.